Hi, I'm John. Welcome to a new season of the Placeways podcast. This time around, we have curated the season to be very tightly focused on workplace insights. That's the name of this podcast, Workplace Insights, where we have experts or people that have really interesting things to say about the topic. Today, my guest is Philip Ross. Philip is the founder and CEO of UnGroup and Cordless Group. UnGroup includes the popular global workplace conference WorkTech and WorkTech Academy. Cordless Group includes cordless consultants and cordless resourcing. Philip is a futurist, author, and advisor focusing on people and behaviors. He specializes in predicting the impact of emerging technology on how we work, shop, consume, and live. He has worked with over 1,000 organizations delivering workplace innovation concepts, and his latest book, UnWorking, see the QR code in this video, is a great resource that can definitely help you and your workplace planning. So here's Philip. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You're actually going to be episode 1 of a new series we're doing all about workplace.
Fantastic.
So you're kicking it off for us.
Great.
So I guess let's just get started on I know you've published a book recently. We'll talk about that, but maybe step back and talk about your journey and what you do and what you're excited about.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And the journey started 26 years ago. I founded the business. We saw the collision between technology and physical space with the view that it would change how people used and behaved in physical space. Mm-hmm. And I started out by writing a report called the Cordless Office Report.
Okay.
Back in 94, which at the time people thought I was completely crazy.
Yes.
This is pre-Wi-Fi, pre-Bluetooth, pre-5G, or pre-GSM basically. And if I roll forwards, a lot of what we predicted has happened.
Yes.
And along the way, I've got I've written a number of books, and I've got a number of companies that are trading, which are all allied to this kind of vision of future work.
Yeah. Did the thing that the predictions you made that have come true, did it happen as fast as you expected? Did it take slower? Certain things you predicted a bit longer than others?
I think there was a burst in the 90s. I kind of when I was researching, I was accessing the labs of people like Ericsson and Motorola and HP, and I was amazed by what I saw. I think there was a time there of rapid acceleration in wireless technology. Yeah, and that was the revolution in the 90s that I think we're still experiencing, and I still think there's got a long way to go. Other things, maybe cloud adoption, portables and wearables, perhaps was slower to emerge, but the connectivity was the revolution.
Yeah. And what did you make any predictions back then that perhaps surprised you, like didn't pan out the way you thought?
Yeah, look, I think we talked about the idea of a cableless office. We obviously looked at things like a paperless office. We tried to look at all the anchors that were constraining people from being mobile and flexible. Some vanished and then reappeared. The death of the PC with the emergence of a portable endpoint was then challenged by VDI and fixed terminals and the benefits there. And so we had some waves of debate. The pandemic has perhaps helped shape what is the next generation. And some things were slower than others. Fears of security and performance held back a lot of organizations. But you're seeing now people who say we're wireless first and mobile first. And for me, that's a really great endorsement.
And is that to drive a particular user experience? And was it the same, decades ago when you're making these predictions that's a technology headline like the cordless office, but what user experience was that enabling back then?
Yeah, well, I think, look, I mean, if you rewind, and I've written a few books about the office and the history. I mean, we were sedentary, chained down to desks with anchored technology. It was first the typewriter, into the word processor, into the desktop PC, but that and the telephone, which Bell kind of invented 120 odd years ago, anchored us and meant that it drove behavior. We commuted to a container for work. We sat behind an allocated desk, and it was efficiency and time and motion. And I think as both technology emerged and the knowledge worker emerged, the two together require something very different. And I think that was that kind of beautiful marriage of convenience that kind of showed us that there was a different way of working.
So what are your big predictions today looking forward? So that, I mean, it seems like you have a history of getting it right. Is it because it's obvious, because human nature is easy to predict and the technology is just surrounding us? What are your predictions for the next 5 years?
Well, I think they kind of span a range of things. I think in terms of the organization, we're moving away from that classic org chart that was always used to accommodate us in buildings towards something that's much more data-centric, based on the real work that's taking place. I mean, for the first time ever, through platforms, be it Viva Insights and 365 to Zoom to Slack, you can get a feel for the real organizational network, and you can accommodate that as opposed to a hypothetical one. And with that comes more fluidity, more team-orientated working, and therefore we can accommodate this more fluid style of working, which suits many people and eliminates the meeting overload that we have, and shows that there's much more ability to have diversity and choice as part of the working experience, as opposed to a kind of one-size-fits-all, monotonous, repetitive approach.
Yeah, I've seen you talk previously, actually, as a YouTube video I looked up today, and it was dated maybe 5-6 years ago, where you're talking about how the workspace needs to be, not so precious, so people can come in and make it their own. That rings true today, for sure, because we now have experience of literally making the workplace at home, where we have complete control over our environment. How do you see this maturing into modern workplaces today? Can you think of any examples where workplaces embrace this and they have made it, not as concrete, open for their employees to change the environment?
Yeah, look, there's some great examples. I think, look, you're right. I think most workplaces were homogenous. It was a facilities efficiency approach. Every desk was the same. And yet, if you look at the values of most organizations, diversity is on that value statement.
Yes.
And why is that there? Because people know the benefits of employing people from diverse backgrounds. And yet we park that at the front door of our office buildings and force people into a one-size-fits-all box.
Yeah.
I think now we have the ability to kind of truly embrace diversity, choice, inclusion, and give people space and experience that's aligned to who they are and what they're trying to do. And that can be just not normal diversity metrics, but cognitive and neuro metrics, where we can truly align workspaces with the real needs of people. And that gives you a heterogeneous approach, variety, and that's exciting. And with it, personalization.
Yeah.
And I think personalization of the workplace experience will be a big trend for the future.
And I think another key thing to talk about there is density, right? Like if we're in this stage right now where hybrid work is just part of life, where it's going, you might have some comments on that. I'm not sure. But the value in the workplace is energy in some cases, and energy, and it comes from a lot of people being near each other, feeding each other's energy levels. I feel like that's lost for many workplaces today. How do they get that back?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's the big challenge. And I'm walking around offices all over the world at the moment, and they mostly feel like a morgue. I mean, it's pretty grim. And as you said...
Well, I'm finding, and you're here in Sydney on a work trip, I'm finding when I travel overseas for work, people are coming in to meet me, and that's the only time they've been in for a week or a fortnight.
Right. Yeah.
They're like, I came in just to have this meeting. I'm like, okay, that's interesting.
I know. And we had our Work Tech conference yesterday, and that was the debate of the day. And we're seeing this all over the world. There's two schools of thoughts, and I mean, in our academy, we've got some research which compares the Muscovite approach, named after we know who, to the Metabite approach, which is much more freedom and choice. And I think there's a tension now. I think we're trying to get people to magnetize as opposed to mandate.
Yeah.
And that's the big challenge for those in decision-making positions. How do you magnetize people to want to come in? How do you make them earn the commute? How do you make them have an experience that's valuable? Because if you get there and you spend the day in this dumb, empty, vibeless container, you don't want to come back.
Yeah. What I've been thinking a lot about lately, as someone that manages people, particularly a lot of young people, younger than myself, I have enough experience knowing my own work style, like what works best for me. And I guess, I'm interested in this on an academic level and professionally, it's sort of what I do, right? But the younger generations haven't had experience in the workplace to really learn different work styles and what works best for them. Do you think there's a disadvantage to younger generations that have never had this experience around people and exposure to different work styles? They're just sort of told, you're working from home.
Yeah.
work it out for yourself.
Yeah.
Not like how to set a schedule of different types of tasks that work best with each other. Yeah.
I mean, look, these are the biggest challenges we're seeing, and every client we're consulting to says, how do we resolve the intergenerational workplace?
Yeah.
And you're right. Younger generations need to learn. They need to get mentored. They need to learn not just by kind of planned training, but osmosis, observation, absorption. And these things are tacit. They're difficult to define. And if they're not there with people with more experience in the same place at the same time, how does that happen? So I think it's not just the kind of learning organization, and that's we cover this in the new book. It's also the idea that social capital is really being built with difficulty by younger people. I mean, we spent a lot of our careers building our social capital, building our brand, and that comes from being with people in physical space, building relationships. Having the coffees and the kind of social side of work as much as the more formal side of work. And I think we're struggling. I think the secret is to be intentional. We can't reinvent, we can't force what we had before, but we can be intentional. And I think the data and the platforms that will shape that experience, which is going to be intentional, is very exciting.
Yeah, and the data is interesting because I'm really interested in on this generational thing and the inexperience. Like, if we ask somebody who hasn't had a lot of work experience, what type of space do you need? They might not know. They don't know what they don't know. So if that survey-based data may not be the right thing to listen to for certain cases.
It's irrelevant.
And it's like, well, who decides on what type of space we need for the employees? Does someone make a decision on behalf of others? What is their data source? Is it all just hard data and what's happened historically? How has work changed? How do all the different personas come together? It's such a big challenge. It's like it's how technology can facilitate a lot of this, but there's a lot of thinking that needs to happen before the technology is brought in.
I agree. I mean, look, in UnWork, which is our innovation consultancy, we have a data science team, and they spend their days looking at data sets and correlating. And that's the secret. It's not just one individual data set. It's about the correlations and the links. And, you are well versed in spatial data. We have the idea of digital exhaust, which I love. The idea that we can gather a huge amount of insight as to how people are using buildings and how buildings are performing. And then if you overlay that with people performance through things like 365, that becomes really fascinating. So when you can measure a distinct team, let's say a sales team of 1,000 people, you look at why are the top 10% of performers better than the bottom 10%? What are they doing differently? How much time do they spend in the office? Where do they work? How many meetings do they have? But how many emails do they send a day? What's the size of their network? All of these things begin to kind of share success, and you can compare that to a lower performer and then perhaps build a plan to improve people or otherwise.
There's a whole rabbit hole on if you go to YouTube and search productivity, the productivity YouTubers out there trying to work out what's the best combination of work and rest and everything else you can do to hack yourself to be productive. The average person isn't thinking about that. They're just going to work. And sometimes work is just work. And it's up to others to look at that and design a system for their employees, or have the space be encouraging things without anyone really realizing it.
Exactly.
I think that's an exciting part about design in general is the impact it can have when you zoom out and think about it at that academic level. Like we're ultimately trying to make people happy and productive. Let's work backwards from there.
And that's interesting because if you look at mental health, stress, that becomes a very interesting indicator. And again, Viva Insights has measures of stress and mental health. And I think when you look at attrition, some good people leave your organization, then you look back at the data and say, well, what might have happened that could have prevented that? And you can then course correct going forward. So I think some of these things it's a trend I call the science of work. I mean, this is what we need to now look at, and data science should be part of that process.
I think work in general is important, right? Like there's a lot of people say when you retire, you die sooner, right? If you keep working,
so true.
you live longer.
Yep.
So there's something about work and the human condition that we enjoy working. It gives us something that you can't even really put your finger on exactly. It's hard to articulate. Why do we need to work? You know, technology and automation has been around for a long time. Yeah. We still work as long as we always have. That's right. Maybe more.
Yes.
But a new wave of automation is coming. Yeah. With large language models, etc.
Yes.
But we're still going to work if that replaces
maybe different work.
It replaces some functions, but we're going to find work for ourselves.
Yeah. And you're touching on kind of the need for belonging, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is around purpose. You know, why am I here?
Yeah.
What am I going to get out of this day? And do I feel a sense of belonging?
Yeah.
And I think most offices don't share that. They don't instill that. And you asked earlier about where I've seen something different. And I think I am seeing, you know, we're doing some quite interesting projects where we are listening to leadership and to people. And again, you said you don't know what you don't know, right? And coming up with original, much more creative ideas as to what workspaces they really want. And it's not about desks. It's about places to be together, but places that you feel belonging. And I think the best analogy is to borrow on the members clubs, which is a very British tradition potentially, but they are re-emerging like there's no tomorrow around the world.
I've noticed this.
And they're designed to be perhaps more residential in feel, a bit more domestic, less corporate, a place that you want to be, that you feel some exclusivity and
activity. Even you know the WeWork model, where smaller businesses go in there because they get the benefit of working like a larger business in a way, because you have office managers creating events, and there's workout programs and all these things you wouldn't have access to on your own as a small to medium business, and that really activates and motivates people. I think there's something in that for sure, and I feel that, you know, you're here in our Sydney office. It's quite small. We have about 20 people that work in Sydney. Only 3 people come in, and the space doesn't feel very active unless we have something going on, unless we plan something, unless we say today is a day where we're doing something interesting. It's somebody's birthday. Come in.
But you're right. I think amenity becomes really interesting. We're seeing some great examples of companies who have reinvented their physical space, much more amenity rich, and it's much more about being with people as opposed to being individual. Both from work and amenity. You know, you don't want to come to work out on your own in the gym. You can do that where you live now, but you might want to come to work to play in a band, you know, to make music with colleagues, right? Or to cook together or do more group endeavor.
Well, you can say that's my incentive to come play my double bass. I have to come to the office. I don't have it at home. But there's also the flip side of this, where there's sometimes just an assumption that at home is where you might do some productivity-based work, and the office is where you collaborate. Personally, and I would love to hear your personal work style as well, your personal persona on how you work. Personally, I like to come into the office to do my productivity work. It's where I focus. There's fewer distractions, and I can just I know I can get something done in a set number of hours. And sometimes it's that change of environment for me that I need. And because most of my conference calls are, you know, on my laptop, that I can easily do at home. And then I walk to the office. So it's also exercise for me. That's the added incentive. So I'm not just going from my bedroom to my home office and walking, 50 steps. I'm getting my 10,000 steps a day because I walk to and from the office. So what's your personal work style? Is it, are you in line with what you're seeing in your own research, or are you an outlier?
No, I mean, we very much practice what we preach. And I've got offices around the world, but I've got 2 main London offices, both of which are kind of meeting hubs, basically. So no one has a fixed desk or office. They're places that are social to come together. And I think that is driving a lot of ideas. I'm not sure many companies have got it right yet. You mentioned this idea of deep work and focus. Well, actually, if you go into most offices, they're distracting. It's just a big space with open desks and people trying to do Zoom calls at the desk. And actually, it's not ideal for many to do focused work. And all the research around flow and concentration shows that you need at least 18, 20 minutes of uninterrupted time to get into a state of flow. And I think actually we have badly designed offices for that. And I think there's a bit of a reimagination, because you're right. I mean, we can't just divorce work from home and office in a binary way, because you're going to spend the day in the office and do various activities through the day. So this idea of a heterogeneous approach of variety and choice aligned to your work style and activities, I think is fundamental.
Yeah. But being self-aware helps a lot, though, like understanding what works, back to that generational thing where they might not have the experience, choosing the right space to suit that. Like I need to get this proposal out the door.
Yeah.
What space suits me?
Yeah.
And they won't have access to this knowledge.
But it's interesting that obviously there's a bit of a gold rush at the moment for workplace apps. And these apps are not just about booking a space, but actually shaping an experience.
Yeah.
And I think people for the first time ever have got to go through a decision tree, right? So the decisions are, where will I work tomorrow? If I'm going to come into a location, who else will be there? Mm-hmm. And if I'm going to come in with the right people, what space do I need to make it really effective based on the activity?
Yeah.
And those decisions need to be shaped through some kind of app or platform.
Yes.
To allow that kind of process and experience to be intentional.
With suggestions based on science.
Exactly.
Yeah, based on the data. So
exactly that.
And removing friction. Another one of my main talking points in many of my presentations is we don't need another app. We just want to automate as much experience as possible. Ideally, there is no digital interaction.
Yep.
Everything responds to you.
To you, exactly.
And I think maybe this is a good segue into AI today. I think that's almost the promise of what we can do is, AI language models are very good at comparing and looking at large data sets, perhaps looking at reference material, and then perhaps looking at what a user is asking through a chat interface.
Yep.
And then it gives you results based on that.
Yeah.
Where should I work today?
Yeah.
It will have context-aware responses, and I think that's something. Obviously it's big in every industry right now, ChatGPT. But I think we're going to see so much of this get released rapidly.
Yes.
That it will become an everyday experience for us pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And chat has been for a long time anyway.
Yeah. Exactly that. But I think, look, we have this idea of a kind of a value stack of smart space. And I think a lot of people are stuck at the bottom around efficiency, saving energy, saving waste, running things efficiently. But as you go up that stack, it becomes localized, which I think is fascinating, but then personalized and then contextualized.
Yes.
And that's the secret. And what you hear from the innovators, whether it's Microsoft Places and others, that we're going to begin to get that contextual experience based on our calendars and so on.
Yeah.
But you said something very interesting about well-being. I mean, that's our next level, is sentience.
Yes.
And I think actually intentional sentience becomes quite interesting.
Yes.
You talked about the number of steps you take a day. Well, we can measure that. We can see how sedentary we've been, and therefore we can nudge and suggest. And I think that's a really exciting area. We had one client say, could you not create a kind of an idea where people leave after a day's work healthier than when they arrived?
Yeah.
And with some clients, we've been trying to manage and track that and prove that some workplaces are more healthy than others.
Yeah. And sometimes there's some simple things you can do. I mean, that for me, that's my baseline. If I walk to the office and back every day I come in, at least 3 days a week, that's I'm hitting my targets those 3 days, and I don't need to go to the gym on those days. And the days I don't, I will go to the gym. So, and then it'll be interesting to see, is my performance better on those days? Am I in a better mood? So my meetings go well, or I've got more attention for the meeting, so I don't need to have a follow-up meeting because I was paying attention the first time.
Exactly.
This struggle for attention and I think mental clarity is very much aligned with wellness, and exercise. I have gone through some of those rabbit holes of productivity on the productivity YouTubers, and I find it fascinating and interesting, and I try things out myself all the time, like fasting and ice baths and getting enough exercise, and you do feel there's a barrier to entry there, but you do feel different on those days.
Absolutely.
And how do we make this more common though, more accessible to people?
Yeah.
And how does technology relate? And I think that just comes down to making it visible and part of a workflow and part of an experience.
Yeah. And I think next generation, Gen Z, will absolutely expect this.
Yeah.
I mean, the apps they're using, the way they are running many of their lives through kind of routines that help measure their well-being.
Yes.
It's fascinating that they track and expect to track and compare and compete and so on.
Yeah.
So I think that gamification of the workplace is coming.
Yeah.
And I think the expectation that employers can use data productively to help shape your well-being is also going to be accepted.
Yeah. Gamification is it's an incentive, right? So it's incentivizing behaviors and user experiences. And I think this is a really powerful thing. And even in recent projects, I've seen when there's an incentive, an experience that might typically have a higher barrier to entry, the barrier is almost removed. I'll give an example. With Suncorp, they have a great new head office in Brisbane, and they came up with a really clever. So the credit to the client, not to anyone else. They came up with a clever way of having people check into desks, and it's as simple as not powering the desk. So they came up with a way for the QR code check-in to turn the circuit on that enables power to the desk.
Yep.
Most people want power at their desk. They don't care about another screen often. They don't care about an Ethernet cable, obviously. It's all unwired now. But power is still something they want. So that's the incentive. And I think there's many, if you look at incentivizing things that might have a bit of friction, it can help remove that friction. And I think gamification is the next step for that. Literally having like a leaderboard and points built into things that are transactionable with other things that you want in the office. I've seen some good examples of that. PwC Singapore, one of our clients had points that you could give to someone for doing a good job, or whatever you want. You give a reason for the points. You have a points wallet yourself, and then you can use that to redeem on features in the office, as well as coffee and food in the cafeteria. And that's like something you can start applying that all throughout. And then it just gets into a weird sort of area though, where it's like the social score in China, and people might be put off by some of these things, but perhaps not the younger generations. But that's an assumption. I haven't seen the data on this.
I mean, look, it's fascinating. I mean, you touched on food and beverage. That is a massive part of experience of being in a space, but it's also a massive part of health and well-being. So, people I think will begin to accept the idea that your employer is helping to keep you healthy. And it goes all the way through from steps, as you mentioned, but sleep patterns, resting heart rates, all these things have a huge impact. And I think, we all have circadian rhythms, and they're all different. And again, the technology of the office can begin to match those rhythms to how we're working. Lighting is obvious. There's some amazing lighting technology coming through, but other aspects, what we eat and drink makes a huge difference.
That a lot of these fitness apps have a readiness score for your next workout based on how you slept and other metrics as the input. That's something I've been thinking of, like that would be great for meetings.
That's right.
My readiness score for this meeting is too low. Let's reschedule.
Exactly. All the room's environment is not great, right? I mean, we're measuring now everything from CO2 levels and pollutants and so on. And, no one knew that before. We had smart space.
That's very topical here in Australia, where we have bushfires, right? So I imagine that came up in the conferences that you've been running here. Right. And I feel like, though, people only think about it every bushfire season, and we haven't had one for a while because we had the opposite problem in Australia with floods. So there hasn't, we're overdue for another bushfire season. So
that's right.
That will happen again eventually, and everyone's going to be thinking about monitoring the air quality, where it's so much more important than just those edge cases. It's just everyday air quality is important for not feeling sluggish at work, and talking of incentives, another way to bring people back to the office, if that's your intention, the air quality is better than at home. It's more environmentally friendly to run air conditioning in a managed commercial building than your 10-year-old, single whatever it is dwelling.
And cheaper, because
cheaper,
in many places in the world, energy is a real issue in terms of cost. That we're seeing that across the EU market, just that the cost of energy is a number one driving factor for a lot of smart building technology. It's exactly.
Like, what's our direct return on investment? All this user experience stuff, that's nice to have, but we're spending a lot of money on energy right now. So I guess one of my last questions is your latest book's called UnWorking.
UnWorking.
Latest book's called UnWorking. What does that mean?
Well, look, we wrote it at the end of the pandemic, so we came out recently. We've had a great success. I mean, it's sold out. We're reprinting already. It just shows that there's a mood globally to understand the next generation of work. And there was a great article by Tom Wolfe in the American Spectator called "The Great Relearning." After a pandemic in San Francisco. So we kind of thought, look, how do we reimagine work after the COVID pandemic? And we thought, actually, the idea of UnWorking, which is based on my company UnWork, is about unbundling and unraveling and unlearning. I think people tried too easily to iterate and make small changes. Actually, to kind of move forward, you've got to step backwards. And unlearning habits, kind of unraveling the assumptions of work, and then reimagining it was the philosophy behind UnWorking.
I imagine some of the habits we picked up during that short COVID period, short in hindsight, right? The history of the workplace, negatively impacting how we're thinking about workplaces today is also something to relearn or unlearn.
Yes.
And things like the opposite of collaboration, social distance. And it's still sometimes a consideration in projects, and there's still like a hangover from that period, I think, that we need to get over.
There is, and there's a continuing dilemma. I mean, hybrid brings its own problems. I mean, digital equity is still a huge issue for organizations. People are no longer going to be all in the same room at the same time, by and large. And those who are remote have always had a second-class experience. So how do we reimagine space? And in the book, we talk about the geometry of spaces and question why all rooms are rectangular.
Yes.
And the way that the technology for collaboration's emerging is also fundamental for people to understand and get right. And we predict a very different typology of space going forwards.
I have some friends that are architects, and at dinner parties, I often offend them by saying, "Oh, you just draw rectangles for a living,"
So true. It is, right?
Yeah.
I know. Boxes with rectangles.
That's right.
And yet we all sit around campfires together, and the circle, open space
and
technology.
Some of our favorite spaces, if you really think about it, don't follow that convention.
Exactly.
So like concert halls and Sydney Opera House recording studios, they're built for acoustics, which means, that's a terrible design for acoustics. But it actually feels better too. It's not just the sound energy. The energy of the room feels better in general.
I think energy of space is a really interesting thing to get right. What is the arrival experience? I think, we do a lot of experience design, which is not really done with workplace. It hasn't been a part of kind of workplace thinking. But you can be intentional. You can design the experience you want people to have. You can look at the touch points and the moments of truth, and you can measure them. And there's that kind of marginal gain that comes from the attention to data that I think is really interesting.
What final recommendations do you have for people in workplace? Is it a time to make big changes? Is it a time to experiment, or should they sit on the fence and wait? What's the next step for them?
Well, look, in UnWorking, we make 10 predictions for the future. I think for me, you have to have an approach which is kind of perpetual beta or beta. This idea that actually you're experimenting, there's innovation as part of the DNA of workplace. I think measurement is fundamental, and using that data to try and shape and reshape and continuously improve what we're doing. I think listening to people is interesting, but as you said before, you don't know what you don't know. So I think it's up to this profession to really come up with some new creative ideas, to prototype, to test and improve. So therefore, that kind of classic design thinking is fundamental to getting this right.
Yeah, great. I think that's a good place to end. Thanks very much.
Pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Cool.